Welcome back. We now have arrived at the fourth session of the symposium, and we are in this looking at legacies. So, as I said, we're looking at Chambers as an educator, the impact of Chambers on Sir John Soane, and then Sherston will look at the relevance of Chambers for architects practicing today. So our first speaker is Sigrid de Jong, who is a senior researcher and lecturer in the history and theory of architecture at ETH in Zurich, having previously worked at Leiden University. She is particularly interested in human responses to buildings, and many of you will know her Rediscovering Architecture Paestum in 18th Century Architectural Experience and Theory, which was published by Yale University Press in 2014. She's also published on Sandby's Royal Academy lectures as pioneering texts of the picturesque. At the moment, she is working on a book on Paris and London and the emergence of architectural experience. Her title today, as you can see, is The Aspiring Professor William Chambers as a Teacher of Architecture.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Frank and Max for inviting me. So I start with a teaser, written by Chambers. An exercise to be recommended to students is to make choice of any design of a building, the worse the better. So we will return to this towards the end. To point out to the student the course he ought to steer, the dangers he has to avoid, the object he must constantly keep in view, was one of William Chambers' objectives in his 1791 edition of a treatise on a decorative part of civil architecture. Chambers had written similarly in his lecture notes for the London Royal Academy of Arts, addressing his recommendations to future architects. In the years 1770-1771, Chambers prepared to temporarily substitute the then Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy, Thomas Sandby. Although Chambers' notes were in the end never transformed into actual lectures, his educational ideas would be included in his treatise. Today, starting from his lecture notes, I aim to make a first attempt to reconsider Chambers' role in architectural education, a topic that would require a more thorough examination. Such reconsidering his role would include exploring Chambers' influence on Sandby, and we have seen this one before, but drawn by Sandby here, for example, for the picturesque and the sublime, and to situate his thoughts both in French architectural teaching and against the background of the turbulent political circumstances and developments of the period. When writing this paper, I was actually tempted by an article I read in The Guardian, and it was titled "The Big Idea, Why We Should Study the History That Never Happened," and written by Dundee Das, and thus suggests taking counterfactual history seriously, or as Richard J. Evans has proposed in his book Altered Past, Counterfactuals in History, to look at the insights, pitfalls, and intellectual implications of changing one thread in the weave of history. And thus says it is time perhaps that we pay new attention to fragments and lost voices, to missed turns, to the history that was not recorded and the history that did not happen. I thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if we would imagine that Chambers actually had become the Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy. Now, when turning to the what if of Chambers being the Professor of Architecture, let us give new attention to some fragments of Chambers' aspirations, ideas, and background. This includes his time in Paris, where he met the French Professor of Architecture and his mentor, Jacques-François Blondel. And Blondel had founded his École des Arts in Paris in 1743. And Chambers, as we know, would be one of the founders of the Royal Academy 25 years later. His experience at Blondel's School of Art certainly inspired him to later found the Academy in London. Now, in the autumn of 1749, when the école had been open for 6 years, Chambers enrolled in Blondel's school and was taught from 8 in the morning until 9 at night, 6 days a week. Every morning, the students had classes with Blondel or other teachers, and in the afternoon, they learned geometry, mechanics, and perspective, among other topics. And in addition, they were taught the history of art, architecture, stereotomy, sketching, and drawing. Importantly, the Chambers took part in the twice weekly excursions to buildings in Paris and surroundings. And these were a crucial element in Blondel's architectural education at his school. And these trips taught students to critically examine buildings from different periods. In order to build knowledge from experience, or as Blondel put it, it is necessary to reflect on the layout of the facades, to examine the inside of the building, to return to the outside, to remember the reason why they were built, and to consider what kind of building it is, what kind of apartment, by whom it was meant to be inhabited. In short, Blondel's aim, in his own words, was to provide his students with a profound theory, a very great practice, a long series of experiences. He taught his students le bon goût, so good taste, because he claimed, and I quote here, "Taste combined with the rules shapes a good architect. It is necessary to know that architecture, apart from its rules, is an art of taste, of genius, and of invention." Blondel's contribution was to develop a connection between architectural experience and its use in design. His was a 3-stage approach. So first, the experience of a building, followed by theorization, and finally, application in the act of designing. And this approach was to have a profound influence on the pedagogies in Paris and London, training generations of architects to design with the experience of future users in mind. Now, his second fragment we are presented with is Chambers' second French sojourn in 1774, and that's the year in which Blondel died. So from Chambers' both French periods, drawings remain. And you might know this image. It's from his well-known Franco-Italian album, and this dates from his first visit, and also includes drawings from his period in Italy. So it features the buildings he visited with Blondel, for example, the Porte Saint-Denis, the Val-de-Grâce, the Château de Maison, the Louvre colonnade, which Blondel called one of the 4 wonders of French architecture, and several decorative details of other buildings. For example, the Rococo interiors of apartments in the Palais Royal. Now, during his second visit to Paris in 1774, Chambers had the opportunity to examine the newly erected buildings, such as the School of Surgery, so the École de Médecine, and the Mint, so La Monnaie, and the latter, as you see here, being the inspiration for his design of Somerset House, as we know. So thus, on the basis of his experiences in France, we can imagine Chambers as a professor of architecture, both integrating contemporary and historical French architecture in his teachings, and explore edifices in London and surroundings with his students in order to build their knowledge and taste through experience. Now, in his treatise, Chambers emphasized the importance of travel and experiencing buildings firsthand. His Royal Academy lecture notes had also stated as such, and he wrote there, "Traveling awakens the imagination. The sight of greatness and uncommon objects elevates the mind to sublime conceptions and enriches it with numerous and extraordinary ideas." Now, as we heard before, he maintained the close friendships with French architects and patrons he had met when traveling in Rome, as Jean de Vailly and Julien David Leroy, and he corresponded with them in French. And throughout his career in London, Chambers kept in touch with those French colleagues, and he had a special friendship with Leroy. And Leroy became in 1762 assistant professor at the Académie Royale d'Architecture, which was founded in 1671. And when Blondel became the professor at that school. And Leroy succeeded Blondel actually as a professor of architecture in 1774. So Chambers was thus surrounded by professor friends, we could say. And he was a corresponding member of this academy from 1763. So Leroy and Chambers exchanged extensively in letters, sent each other books, and visited each other in Paris and London. And this is a letter from Leroy to Chambers. And they can both be seen as agents of architectural ideas. Chambers of French ideas in London, and Leroy of British ideas in Paris. And Chambers can even be said to have an influence on academic teaching in Paris, as he sent his own books to his colleague and Professor Leroy and suggested he would show these to his students. And for instance, Chambers writes to Leroy in August 1772, who lives in the Louvre. I will just read it in French so you can see how well. He wrote, Mon cher ami, je viens de publier un livre sur le jardinage qui est assez bien réussi ici. Je l'ai fait traduire en français. Je vous envoie un exemplaire français et anglais relié et un autre pour Monsieur Voyer d'Argenson, que je vous prie tous les deux d'accepter. J'ai envoyé un exemplaire sur grand papier pour l'Académie, que vous aurez la grâce de faire présenter. Outre quoi, j'ai envoyé 82 exemplaires que vous aurez la bonté de donner à quelques libraires pour vendre, pour mon compte, à 3 livres 10 sols par copie en feuille. Vous trouverez le tout dans une caisse à votre adresse que M. Molini doit envoyer d'ici à son frère à Paris aujourd'hui. Ma femme et mes enfants vous saluent. Faites mes compliments, Monsieur de Foyer, et à tous nos amis. Je suis très sincèrement, etc., etc., William Chambers. So, and another letter, on 14 May 1773, Chambers writes to Leroy, Mon cher ami, je viens d'envoyer par Monsieur Molini, selon ce que vous me demandez, 4 livres chinois et 4 jardins de Kew, pour lesquels vous m'enverrez de vos ruines d'Athènes quand l'occasion se présentera. Leur valeur, selon nos prix d'ici, est de 14 louis. Pour mon architecture, so that's the treatise, dont vous demandez 2 exemplaires, je n'en ai point à présent, car la vente cet hiver a été beaucoup plus considérable que je ne croyais, de sorte qu'il ne me reste point actuellement, excepté quelques exemplaires qu'il faut garder pour le débit de Londres jusqu'à une 3e édition. So, as much as Leroy was savoring Chambers' ideas on Chinese gardens, Chambers was eagerly adopting Leroy's ideas on the force of colonnades and the role of the spectator in observing these, as he had analyzed in his essay sur la théorie de l'architecture, so his essay on theory of architecture, in his book Les ruines des plus beaux monuments de la Grèce. That was the 2nd edition, 1770. So he refers to this in the letter. And Leroy's account of the Louvre colonnade presented one of the first cases in which the spatial experience of architecture was recorded as a narrative that unfolds over time. And his ideas on the necessity of continuous movement and interrupted with pauses when perceiving architecture also resonated with Chambers, as we've seen in Max's paper. And Chambers wrote in his Royal Academy lectures about this necessity, and here you see it below, of a variety in peristyles because the form changes as the spectator removes his situation or as the sun increases or diminishes the shadows. Now, Chambers' lecture notes are kept in the collections of the Royal Academy and of the RBA. And the RBA catalogue describes these as mainly covering the history and aesthetics of architecture, but also including one on the architectural profession and on the qualities and accomplishments necessary in a great architect. The RA catalogue indicates these notes dating from 1770 to 71 as a group of fragments of a fairly miscellaneous nature, all relating to the history of architecture. And parts of these treat the impact of ideas such as Burke's Sublime, while the majority show a concern with the antiquity of architecture and the importance of geographical and cultural terrain as a developmental factor. Now, Chambers' concern with achieving the sublime in buildings is, for example, readable from this fragment up here. He wrote, "In exterior decoration, the grandiose or sublime is always to be aimed at. Where the dimensions are inadequate, artifice must be employed to produce the desired effect." And he writes also about how sameness and repetition are sources of grandeur, resonating Burke's ideas. And these would then be resonating in Sandby's Bridge of Magnificent, which was imagined to be situated next to Chambers's Somerset House. Now, in other notes, Chambers is quoting from publications by Vitruvius, Laugier, or Blondel, reflecting on the position of invention in architecture and on submitting to climatic realities when designing architecture. He also dedicates some notes on character in architecture. Thoughts that might have been inspired by Blondel's Cours d'Architecture, which appeared 1771 until 77. And this publication was derived from Blondel's lectures at the Académie Royale. And in his first volume, Blondel presented 38 possible characters within architecture, which included the sublime, the virile, the feminine, the mysterious, and the terrifying. And some of these ideas also ended up in Chambers' book on the Chinese gardens, as we've heard. In his lecture notes, Chambers writes on the choice of appropriate character for a building, on the adoption of correct general character fit for the use of the building, and on the impact of national character on architecture. But he also writes a note contrasting male and female qualities. And other notes are on Roman, Greek, and Etruscan or Gothic architectural forms, ornament, and style. Fascinating is also a note on gentlemen amateurs and bungling architects, and on a swipe at swarms of poorly informed gentlemen and artificers who think they know about architecture. Now, historian John Harris described Chambers in his book as avoiding the role of flamboyant actor, neither preferring the footlights nor the social accompaniments of greatness and fame. And he reminded his readers of when Horace Walpole praised the treatise on civil architecture as the most sensible book and the most exempt from prejudice that ever was written in that science. So Harris claims they are the polished reflections of an incredibly learned mind. In fact, Chambers was the supreme example of the scholar architect. So we could say that Chambers assumed the role of professor in his notes, lectures, and books, and very inspiringly so. He comes across as a passionate, erudite, and global architect and teacher. We can easily imagine the professor preparing when he writes a draft summation to be read at the end of the lectures, and suggests this exercise for students where average buildings should be imaginatively rethought into superior ones. And this is the complete one. So an exercise to be recommended to students is to make choice of any design of a building, the worse the better, and by taking the same parts of which it is composed and arranging them in a different manner or in various different manners, produce one or several compositions, either perfect or at least much more so than the original composition. So it's very tempting to imagine what would have happened in the teaching of architecture if that would have been the changing thread in the weave of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sigrid. I almost forgot the time because there was a quote about workmanship and the honour of the workmanship, etc. So our next speaker is Joanna Tinworth, who is curator collections at Sir John Soane's Museum, formerly exhibitions curator there, and who also has conducted research projects for historic royal palaces. Joanna is currently working on the vast collection of drawings for Somerset House at the Soane Museum, which she hopes will be the subject of her PhD thesis. Her title today is Connected Careers, Sir William Chambers, the Consummate Professional Architect, His Legacy and Influence on Sir John Soane.
Thank you so much, Max and Frank, for inviting such a nascent Chambers scholar to a wonderful event and for such collegiate and congenial company. I'm very much enjoying myself. This is Sir John Soane, aged 51, in 1804, at the height of his professional career. The portrait carefully and probably deliberately fails to reveal the fact that Soane was a self-made man. Sponsored by George Dance, the younger, he trained as an architect at the Royal Academy, won the King's Travelling Scholarship to Italy, and then returned to London to found his architectural practice. Soane's unique interpretation of the buildings of antiquity rendered him probably the most original of the neoclassicists. His practice thrived, patronised by the wealthy men he'd met in Italy and their network. Soane held positions at the Office of Works, was from 1788 architect to the Bank of England, became Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy in 1806, and I noticed you'd superimposed Chambers' head on Soane's shoulders just there. That was a great cue, thank you. And he was knighted in 1831. Yet, as a self-made man, Soane modelled, if not his architecture, his professional path on the example of contemporaries. Sir William Chambers, tutor to Frederick, Prince of Wales, and subsequently George III, Surveyor General, was acknowledged as the arch professional and establishment architect in the England of George III. His 1759 treatise and its multiple editions we've heard all about today. It was the supreme example of architectural instruction of the period. So it's inconceivable that a self-made man like Soane would not have plundered Chambers' theories and his career trajectory to inform his own. Soane's collection of works of art, antiquities, drawings and books were not just the working collection of a practicing architect, such as Adams, for example, but an eclectic and highly personal treasure trove, reflective of the man and revealing of his influences and preoccupations. Provenance was super important to Soane, as was the arrangement of his collection, particularly in the latter years of his life, when he was self-consciously shaping his legacy for posterity. And we see Soane's purchases displayed in dialogue with each other in the museum, his house museum, to create multiple meanings, where Soane actually acknowledges the depth through layers of narrative that he felt he owed to mentors, patrons, and friends. Now, despite his long shadow over Soane's era, works relating to Sir William Chambers in the collection, and therefore Chambers' influence on Soane, are surprisingly overlooked. I think I've been giving tours at the museum for 3 years. Don't think I've ever once mentioned Chambers, and that thought really struck me coming into this conference. By comparison, for example, with the role that George Dance and the works of Robert Adam play in the everyday narrative of the museum. So based on the museum's numerous Chambers holdings, this paper is going to assert that Soane was more connected to, interested in, and influenced by Chambers than is generally acknowledged. And here we see on the left a youthful Soane in 1776 as he was about to undertake his tour of Italy, and Chambers, yet again, in 1780 at the apex of his career. And at this point, Soane was indebted to Chambers, as it was he who Soane persuaded to show Soane's drawings to George III, and who lobbied for Soane to receive the King's Travelling Scholarship to Italy. Soane's archive reveals that Chambers considered Soane worthy of his attention and support, sharing with him a letter of advice prepared for one of his own pupils, which Soane evidently valued because it was copied in a fair hand, and Soane inscribed beneath it, which I'm afraid you can't see here. The original letter of Sir William Chambers, the whole in his own handwriting, is now in my possession, a most valuable treasure to the young student in architecture. Extracts from this letter are frequently cited, as is Chambers' advocacy of Piranesi, whose work Soane would later prominently display in his picture room. Yet the following lesser-known Chambers quote that arguably sets the tone for Soane's study of architecture. It is vulgarly said that taste has no rules, but this, like most vulgar opinion, is erroneous. It has many. Some pointed out by books, but more that are not mentioned. It is only by repeated and careful observations that you can arrive at this knowledge. And decades later, we see volumes of preparatory notes for Soane's own Royal Academy lectures, revealing him striving for appropriateness within architectural forms, to find the rules, apparently derived from Blondel, which would perfectly define for Soane the classical language of architecture. Here we have Soane and Chambers further on, 1793, both by George Dance the Younger, and they must have been, in the interim, in regular contact. Chambers subscribed to Soane's 1789 plans and elevations and sections of buildings. Both, though intermittent in their attendance, were members of the Architects' Club, founded in 1791. And Soane was moving in Royal Academy circles in the 1790s, although he wasn't elected associate till 95. But frustratingly, in that huge archive, there's only one entry in Soane's notebook that records that he dined at Greenwich with Sir William Chambers, £1, 3 shillings, on June 28, 1793. So it's impossible to infer from evidence what impact social contact with Chambers might have had on Soane. So what, therefore, of their professional relations? In October 1790, Soane was appointed Clerk of Works to St James's, Whitehall and Westminster, responsible to Chambers as Surveyor General. Chambers stated, "The first requisite to forming a great architect is genius." And Mordaunt Crook subsequently noted that amongst all Chambers' assistants, there was only one architect of exceptional talent, John Soane, and he displayed several of the more infuriating symptoms of genius. Soane was prickly, quick to take offence, and often his own worst enemy, and his employment culminated in a typically Soanean falling out between him and Chambers. In 1793, Soane, pursuing a new role which will allow him to compete to design new Parliament buildings, was frustrated by Chambers offering the role to another, as Soane thought, typically, inferior architect. Soane sulked, neglected his work for Chambers, and refused to meet him at the Office of Works, expecting Chambers to wait upon him instead. And we have a letter in the archive that records Soane saying he felt his work might have been completed long ago if Sir William Chambers had not constantly altered my plans and uniformly done everything in his power to delay the business. Chambers complained to the king the consequences of Soane's absenteeism were great delays and uncertainties in all places belonging to his clerkship, and in January 1794, Soane resigned. His behaviour implies he didn't hold Chambers in the high esteem one would expect from a subordinate to the Surveyor General, or perhaps that he esteemed his own talents as highly as those of Chambers. Yet Soane had experienced at first hand Chambers' equitable treatment of clients and tradesmen alike, the respect in which they held him and the ease with which he masterminded large-scale projects, all of which, with his original talent and reputation for probity, would become hallmarks of Soane's own practice. Soane's collections offer more concrete evidence of his connection to Chambers than do the archives, and it's inevitable, of course, that a student of architecture would study Chambers' publications, but Soane purchased them all, with one notable exception, the 1757 designs of villas, gates, doors and chimney pieces. Soane clearly leaned towards the volumes of architectural theory rather than examples of Chambers' early architectural practice, which plausibly he, with his unique approach, didn't turn to for inspiration. Soane had eventually all 3 editions of the treatise, as well as Gwilt's reissue of 25, 2 copies of Chambers' designs for buildings at Kew, 3 for the designs of Chinese buildings, 1 for the dissertation on Oriental gardening in English, and 2 of each of those in French. And thanks to an 1831 catalogue of books showing here, we know that whereas the 8,000 volumes were scattered literally all over the 3 buildings, Chambers' publications were all stored on the ground floor, easily accessible and close to Soane's study. Soane valued provenance so highly that he owned multiple copies of the same title, including Chambers' works. On the left, one copy is inscribed from the author, just at the top there, 1792, and it's one of only 2 of Chambers' volumes that Soane actually annotated himself, interestingly, at the point here where he's marking Chambers placing the composite order before the Corinthian, as Scamozzi does. And on the right-hand side, we have Reynolds' volume, also purchased by Soane, who would have been very satisfied to have this lovely serendipity of the treasurer and president of the Royal Academy's copy of this treatise. Soane also purchased lots of Chambers' drawings, but it was intermittent, arguing a significant persistence on his part. The variety of Chambers' drawings in the collection is shown here. From some rather fierce-looking candelabra on the top left, the interior of a ballroom to a chimney piece, the design for the mausoleum to the Prince of Wales, and a plan and detail of Somerset House. Soane only spent £14.11 at the sale of Chambers' prints and drawings, but the collection includes over 800 examples. The archives record John Britain supplying occasional drawings between 1816 and 27. But more than 600 drawings for Somerset House bought by Townley at the 1811 sale must have been purchased and probably sought out, actually, by Soane, perhaps as late as 1833, because the Soane Museum curator records these original drawings of Somerset House as being not yet bound up upon Soane's death. His pursuit of drawings of Chambers' most monumental commission indicates the value Soane placed on the author and the building itself, which had been home to the Royal Academy since 1779. Oddly, according to Christie's annotated catalogue of Chambers' book sale, Soane didn't purchase any of the books. Therefore, the 9 that were previously owned by Chambers that Soane now has in his collection, we now have in Soane's collection, again, like the drawings, are a consequence of Soane deliberately seeking them out. The purchases are revealing. The titles reflect Soane's hunger for architectural treatises, and they were Campbell's Vitruvius Britannicus, Ruggieri's Studio di Architectura Civile, Belledor's Sciences des Ingénieurs and Nouveau Cours de Mathématiques, François Blondel's Cours d'Architecture, Scamozzi's Œuvre, Perrault's Ordonnance des 5 Espèces, Wood's Origin of Building, and Freyart's Parallèle de l'Architecture Antique et Moderne. And 5 titles, and I'm showing one here, the Wood, the Blondel, Scamozzi, Freyart, and Parallel, all include Chambers' manuscript notes running to pages of commentary, which you can see in the centre there, thus making Soane privy to Chambers' response to these treatises, which I find fascinating, but you can't go into it in 15 minutes. Chambers' copy of Wood, possibly purchased by Soane as late as 1833 again, included 8 pages of manuscript notes and Chambers' marginal notes, such as stuff and nonsense on one particularly good page, and a pithy summary that says, this book contains a good deal of learning, a great deal of enthusiasm and some nonsense. The author is so desirous of proving his favourite system that he confounds dates, wrests meanings, cites falsely, and in short, sticks at nothing to accomplish his design. Less intellectually incisive than Chambers' example there, Soane was more accepting of Wood's theories, some of which he'd included in his first lecture at the Royal Academy, presenting Wood's theory of the divine origins of architecture apparently comfortably alongside Logier's rational notion of the primitive hut. And Soane in turn annotated Chambers' books. Belledor's Ingénieur includes 4 pages of Soane's notes. 1 volume of the Blondel has Soane's marginal notes, as does the Scamozzi here. You can see them on the right. Soane's purchase of Chambers' 1702 French edition of Freyart's Parallèle is not only meaningful because the English translation was one of the first books that Soane owned, one of the 2 he went to the Royal Academy with, but we sense Soane's evident engagement with Chambers' commentary here. He's literally, here's Chambers at the top, and this is Soane at the bottom. Soane has literally taken note of and copied out Chambers' manuscript note, which is actually recalling Chambers measuring Palladio's buildings in Italy in 1755. And again, with that kind of intellectual strength that we mentioned this morning, you have Chambers opining that Palladio in later life altered and considerably improved his original ideas. Finally, we have a series of Royal Academy lecture drawings in the collection made by Soane's office for Chambers buildings. There's 28 of them, and I'm not going to go into the sort of broader influence of Chambers' treatise on Soane. David Watkins done that brilliantly. But we're going to look at a few of them so that we can see what Soane seemed to consider Chambers' architectural triumphs and transgressions. Firstly, he spent 3 years preparing his lectures, and he went out of his way to approach John Yen, formerly of Chambers' office, for an elevation of Lord Melbourne's house with the plan and elevation of the gateway so he could include it. Ultimately, it got left out. But garden buildings at Kew didn't. They were the most numerous of the examples that Soane presented, which seems consistent with the multiple copies of the designs for Chinese buildings and dissertation on Oriental gardening that he owned. However, Lecture 9 reveals Soane's ambivalence in practice. He welcomes the consistent style at Kew, but finds the density of the buildings overpowering. And at Somerset House, which is also well represented, Soane chose to critique Chambers' as he said, high basement to the Strand front with columns above, which he felt arose out of a neglect of first principles, a theme in Soane's lectures. And we've seen this before. This is Bessborough House, Roehampton. Soane's, again, concerned with rules, observing Chambers' corruption of the rule relating to pediments in his very earliest Notes on Architecture from 1776. And then 40 years later, he's also concerned at Roehampton with pedestals being placed under detached columns, which apparently cannot be admitted in regular architecture. And here we have the Mausoleum to the Prince of Wales. Soane produced fair copies of all of his Royal Academy lecture drawings, and he incorporated this impression of Chambers' highly finished drawing as a mausoleum to the Prince of Wales in Lecture 5. And at this point in the text on the left, we see Soane's typically equivocal public encomium to Chambers. Sir William Chambers' mausoleum, designed for the late Prince of Wales, shows he possessed no small portion of architectural knowledge. The fame of Sir William Chambers will live as long as the work at Somerset House remains, nor is this the only monument he has left. His treatise on civil architecture, the result of close application, deep and erudite thinking, and zeal for our noble art, will always be read with pleasure and profit. So with that whistle-stop tour of everything in the collection, how have I spent 3 years at the Soane and not mentioned Chambers ever in a tour? Why is his influence not more central to the modern experience? And I think partly it's the lull in Chambers scholarship, but actually more specifically, it's the change in access upon which the visitor experiences Soane's house museum that shifted. Nowadays, the museum's primary function is as a museum, and the extraordinary spaces of the ground floor are what dominate. The dome decorated with urns from the Adam collection, the picture room filled with Cleresos and Piranesi's, all privilege those gentlemen's impact on Soane. But in his time, the domestic spaces were equally, if not more important. People would arrive to the eating room, go up the staircase to the drawing rooms for tea, and they immediately then encounter Chambers. It's actually the portrait busts presented in the niches on the staircase of 13 Lincoln's Inn Field, which hold the most meaning for Soane and best reflect his interests and influences. To paraphrase, you could perhaps call it a staircase of British worthies. In the northwest corner of the entrance hall is a marble bust of Thomas Lawrence, President of the Royal Academy. At the first turn in the stairs, the location a testament to Soane's respect for him, and you can see it just there, we meet the official posthumous portrait of Chambers, which has been mentioned, which Soane acquired in 1835. On the first floor, past the South Drawing Room, is William the Pitt the Younger, whose patronage helped Soane secure his coveted post as architect to the Bank of England, and whose extended family provided Soane with private commissions. Finally, on the second floor, outside the door to Soane's private apartments, we find George Dance the Younger, Soane's mentor, whose support offered Soane his first architectural training and access to the Royal Academy. In short, the busts on the staircase represent relationships Soane perceived as pivotal in his life and career, whereas where he sits in the dome there, he's got Michelangelo and Raphael as mere supporters of him. The breadth and depth of Chambers-related material in Soane's collection indicates his admiration for Chambers, but it's this prominent placement which locates Chambers in Soane's view as the consummate professional architect worthy of pride of place in the pantheon of architects whose achievements the collection celebrates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. And our final speaker in this session is Kerstin Baurup, who is a practicing architect and Professor Emerita of Architectural Conservation at Lund University and former Professor of Architectural Conservation at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm. She has been deeply involved in architectural preservation and the development of heritage buildings throughout Sweden, including the conservation of the extremely significant Engelsberg Ironworks. She is currently visiting professor at the Axel Jonsson Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture at Cambridge. Cheers.
Yes, it's not easy to try to say something after all these very good papers and discussions, but I will take us back to, or forwards to where we are today in time and also maybe in place. Because I think the Western countries have a common past in classical architecture. So the legacy of Sir William Chambers contributes to continuity and also revival for this tradition. Classicism has, until the modern movement, permeated both urban and rural, even Engelsberg. Sweden was an agrarian country until the mining, the ironworks, and the international trade grew from the 17th century and paved the way into the European economy and architecture. So the Swedish welfare, in fact, began with the extraction of iron and copper. And in the middle of the 18th century, iron was in fact 75% of the Swedish export. And most of it was bar iron and going to England. Engelsberg is one of the best preserved ironworks, and its architecture is a manifold combination of classic and vernacular. And also this map shows you where we are and the accumulation of ironworks and copperworks in Sweden a few hundred years ago. You can see them on the map clearly. Bergslagen, where we are, including Engelsberg, was the center of industrialism. Contacts with other countries, not least England, and their skilled craftsmen spread the knowledge about classical architecture. The local know-how about the available materials, wood and stone, contributed to Swedish wooden classicism of its own. And also, finally, about Engelsberg, the houses at Engelsberg Ironworks show a clever use of traditional timber construction in combination with classic building elements, as you can see. But the future of classical architecture will most likely be based on the manifold impressions that architects collect from their own background and from their learning process. The first inevitable, the second is decisive. If we see classicism not as a style, but as an approach to interact with, Sir William Chambers can show us a road towards a sustainable new architecture. Studying his drawing and buildings teaches us a lot. To copy-paste his work is a good training, but not enough to reach a good architectural result today. But if we want to know how we can learn from his legacy to achieve a high-quality classic architecture, we must understand how his eminent work was executed. We know, in fact, after all, quite a lot about him and his work. Chambers didn't just copy-paste antiquity, but how did he become such an elaborate and artistic neoclassicist? So I think we could investigate his background, his learning process, and his working method, because the background matters. Chambers' background, the fact, as we have heard, of how he was born in Gothenburg and the son of a Scottish merchant, it made it natural to work for the Swedish East India Company, even if he got his education in England. His English contacts and travel to the Far East had an impact on his future professional work, as we have heard a lot of today. His learning process was reading books, study tours, measuring classical architecture, sketching and reflection. And we know that he read educational books, Vitruvius, Palladio, Scamozzi, Vignola, Blondel, as we also have heard of today, and other great architects. And he made study tours. When he was very young, as a teenager, he got this possibility to work at the East India Company and traveled, as we heard also, once to Bengal and twice to China. As a young person, he was particularly receptive to new impressions. This became clear in his architecture later on. Chinese architecture was new and exotic in Europe. Chambers studied both mathematics and local buildings in China, Canton. He documented what he saw, as we also have heard a lot about. We can conclude that studying Chinese culture during his young ages made him an early connoisseur of Chinese culture, inspiring and useful later on in England, both among avant-garde and also in the establishment. But after China, as we also know, Chambers made his grand tour to Paris and Italy, where he spent 5 years to study the classical architecture. He got profound knowledge about the French, especially the French architecture, but he also measured and documented the Greek antique legacy in Italy. Parallel with his reading and studies abroad, he used the pencil and integrated his own experience and reflections about the best of the classicism in sketching new architecture. And then his working method, it was to combine his acquired toolbox with the local situation and his own artistic skills. He tested what he had seen, looked at it with critical eyes, and an artistic skill to find out what was useful in this combination of copying and adding his own experience. For example, he could alienate the classical architecture by using foreign elements from China as an eye-opener. So Chinese architecture was very special in Europe at the time, of course. When he wrote a treatise on civil architecture, he pictured the evolution from the primitive buildings to classical architecture. His drawings are romantic and beautiful. Probably he found these lusty but brutal meetings between the local primitive and the elaborate classic exciting and clarifying. The meeting is a link, but also an alienation. As an artist, Chambers could see such clashes to glorify the past and celebrate the evolution. But of course, as we know, he was not alone looking for the original buildings. Logier from Provence wrote an essay on architecture in 1753. And in his second edition, 1755, this picture shows the primitive house with the frontispiece, as you can see to the left over there. It's Chambers to the right. And Milizia, also the neoclassicists from Italy, made the same discussions about the primitive past. I think that Chambers' ideas about how to achieve a new architecture was a more refined but also aching to the ideas of a contemporary Swede. Born in Gothenburg, we heard there was a colony, you could say, of English persons in Gothenburg at the time, and also born by English parents, Fredrik Henrik af Chapman, the King Gustav III's shipbuilder. He built Skärva 1885 to 86, a Swedish country house. And af Chapman and his good colleague and friend Carl August Ehrensvärd, who was a philosopher, artist and military man who had studied the antique in Italy, united the vernacular log timber building under a turfed roof and added a Pantheon hall and a Greek portico, temple portico. Adaptation to the ancient ideals required Nordic proportions, such as lower columns and wood instead of stone. Just copying the antique, although it would have been possible for them, was not the way to a new Swedish architecture as they sought for, but this was. Chambers' learning process is possible to follow also today. Many young architects and students travel and experience marvelous things, but most of them just take some photos and they do not stay long enough to understand and train to document by drawing. And you cannot learn only from other person's experience. That is also what Chambers said. To look at the picture is not at all the same as being in the three-dimensional place that you can just see as a two-dimensional picture otherwise. This has been a problem to us since then. Harald Tavelin, who was a professor of theoretical and applied aesthetics in Lund in the 1980s, he wrote his doctoral thesis on Gestalt perspective, where he highlighted the impossible problem of ordinary perspective drawings and photos. Every person perceives himself as the center of the physical surrounding environment in the room. I'm the center now in my room, you know. The eye see different pictures every little parts of seconds, so we do not see a frozen picture of the room. Therefore, you have to stand in a room to understand the 3 dimensions and the details around you. And that is also how Chambers saw this idea of you have to go to the place. So we have to measure, to draw, to experience the classical architecture in situ, to stand as a gestalt in the room. Chambers writes in the preface of his book on civil architecture, the advantage arising of society from houses are alone very considerable, as they have an influence on both the body and mind. And this tells us the importance to be in the house, in the room, to understand what influence it has on us. And how Chambers himself used his knowledge is visible in his drawings and writings. When we look nowadays at Chambers' beautiful drawings, we must remember that he studied mathematics in China before he studied architecture. So he got to know the beauty of mathematics and geometry. For the ionic order, as you can see on the picture, he discusses Goldman's method, which he finds best in the comparison with other well-known architects' methods, as he writes about. Nicholas Goldman, who was a mathematician from Breslau in Germany, that is now Wrocław in Poland, and in the 700s, studying of mathematics and also geometry, it was self-evident for architects. Chambers used geometry all the time. In his book, a treatise, he says, the apertures of gates being always wide, they are generally made in the form of an arch, that figure being the strongest. But doors, which are usually of small dimensions, are commonly of a parallelogram. The general proportion for the apertures, both of gates and doors, whether arched or square, is that the height be about double the breadth. Then he explains why the primitive huts have small openings. He says, just to let in the person to creep through due to the weather. But when architecture improved and methods were found to close the doors were made of such a size as was necessary for giving admittance to a tall, bulky man without stopping or turning aside. That is, they made it about 3 foot wide and 6 foot high. So he says, so the importance of proportions, mathematics and geometry was studied also by Ehrensvärd of Silén and most others of Grand Tour architects during the 18th and 19th century, also in our country. And Chambers had a great influence on his contemporaries. He knew that this gained knowledge was useful, and he sent books, as we have heard a lot of today, also sent them out to important persons to promote himself and his work, and he was also very interested in discussing his work with others, of course. And he became the teacher of architecture to the Prince of Wales, as we heard, later King George III, and William Chambers prepared the path for architects like Sir John Soane, right now discussed here, in Sweden also, for example, architects like Carl Fredrik Adelkrans and Jean-Erik Gren, Holleman as well, had the same influences from Chambers. The Royal Academy of Science in Sweden got Chambers' books, and Adelkrans was a member of the Academy. And as we also have seen, he made the drawings 1763 for the second China Castle, China Palace in Drottningholm, Sweden. Because the first palace was made in timber and had to be demolished after just 10 years due to rot and fungus. But China's second castle was designed after the books. Adelkrans had, though, not been and not visited China. Like the English royalty, the Swedish Prince Gustav, born 1746, later became Gustav III, he needed architectural knowledge. He was taught geometry and how to draw perspective when he was very young. The book Introduction to the Perspective was written in 1754. It's a very humble and small book, but it's pedagogic for a young child. He became a skilled layman architect, you could say, about Gustav III, and he founded the first formal education in Sweden for architects at the Academy of Fine Arts. Probably geometry and perspective are not so much emphasized today, neither by teaching of royalties or persons with influence on young students of architecture today. So I can conclude saying that Chambers' process is to read books by the masters of architecture, to experience the best original buildings and to sketch and analyze. And Chambers' method to draw new buildings is using the knowledge from the study process combined with the use of local conditions on the site and the addition of personal artistic competence. And the result can be a classical architecture made for special situation, the location, and also with the visible fingerprints from the architects, as was the case before. So obviously architects learn from Chambers and try to find a new architecture based on the old vernacular and the classical architecture. Liselund, that is a Danish building built in 1792, beautifully situated at Møns Klint, it's called, as shown in the drawings. And it is a very good example. Straw roof and timber columns is very Danish and very classical at the same time. So yes, just have, I think, last picture. It is the latest Swedish grace in the 1920s. Classicism here was adapted to the Swedish temperament and environment. This is Gunnar Asplund, interior of Stockholm City Library. It can be compared, Wolf, to the library you showed us before, the Chambers interior. You see the influence seems to come directly from there. An obstacle in modern architecture has been that it is based on recent architecture, as if history started in the 20th century. Classical architecture, and for example, Chinese or Egyptian architecture, is visited but not seen as something to involve in new architecture. But will then learning from and using Chambers' method guarantee that we get good architects? I would say probably not. Very few will be excellent. But I think they will be good enough. And that is not so bad. Thank you.
So we will now have a long-distance presentation from Michael Snowden, who I believe is part Swedish or has Swedish ancestry. Michael was honorary curator and chair of the Strawberry Hill Collection Trust, formerly head of the design section of the Victorian Albert Prints and Drawings, and he catalogued all the Chambers drawings there. He curated in 1996 the exhibition with John Harris at the Courtauld and was involved at the National Museum in Stockholm, and of course is the joint author with John Harris of the volume in 1997. So I'll hand you over to Michael.
Well, apologies for not being with you today. As I am indeed half Swedish, my late mother was Swedish. I feel very at home in Sweden, so it's a great pity I can't be with you. Well, I'm going to say something about the building blocks that have underlain Chambers scholarship, and in particular about the work that came together around the time of the Chambers bicentenary in 1996. The foundation of it all, of course, is John Harris's great monograph, 1970. And as you've just heard, in 1996, John and I curated a major show on Chambers in the Academy exhibition rooms, and that is the crucial thing, at Somerset House, which had been taken over by the Courtauld Institute from about 1989. And this coincided with the start of the recognition of the building's importance, though even then, at that stage, the great courtyard was still filled with tax inspectors' parked cars. Here, at the show's opening, are some of the main players and contributors, including in the background John Harris, Jane Roberts, John Newman on the left, who wrote about Somerset House, of course, Nicholas Goodison, Sir Nicholas Goodison in the centre, And of course, Charles Marsden Smedley, who designed it, was next to Nicholas Goodison. And then, of course, the Prince of Wales, who wrote a heartfelt foreword to the catalogue that expressed his great hope that Somerset House should be fully open to the public and reclaim its status in London's cityscape. Now, as we've just heard, elements of the show went on to Stockholm for Chambers and Adelkrantz, which was, of course, curated by Magnus Olausson. The show, with its 233 exhibits and the book catalogue, opened up, refined and elaborated and examined in detail many strands of inquiry, some of them quite new. These included Jane Roberts on Chambers as a royal builder and tutor. I think she was the first person to look seriously at George III's drawings. Hilary Young's work on discovering Chambers' designs for silver and ceramics, Hugh Roberts and furniture, and of course a crucial presence was Nicholas Goodison, who was chair of the Courtauld and of the exhibition committee, but whose work on Chambers' metalwork and furniture was both pioneering and renowned. Here you see what the picture shows is the great room at Somerset House. This, I think, is the first time the great room was used for exhibitions. The so-called fine rooms were already in use for pictures at this date, but I think this is the first time the great room could in fact be seen in an uncluttered state. And you'll see in the centre a wonderful collection of Chambers designed objects, including the model of the state coach, which Tim Knox mentioned today and is now, of course, on loan to the V&A, which is great news. And then also in that case are some royal loans, which are mostly made by Bolton. And interestingly, the Queen allowed the loan of the famous chimney garniture of clock and two vases by Bolton of 1770s, which actually I think were in her private rooms at Windsor and had never been exhibited before. And that was quite a thing. As you came into the exhibition, there was the great astronomical clock of 1768, also from the Royal Collection. Having talked about all these sort of applied art things, I should say that there were 100 of the 233 exhibits, 151 drawings were of architectural subjects. They don't make exhibitions like that anymore, is all I can say. 59 of those were of Somerset House, and I think that's significant in that it showed what incredible care the Chambers office, comparatively small, and Charles Worsley wrote about this drawing practice in the catalogue book, turned out these hundreds of drawings for Somerset House. Now, the exhibition and book catalogue also brought together the Chambers furniture, which had gradually emerged since the publication of John's catalogue in 1970. And this began with the table that Lars Ljungström has already mentioned, and that is the table made by Georg Haupt, and made specifically for Chambers. It is a most marvellous object, and actually, in the terms of neoclassicism, quite unique, I think, in the way that, as Lars mentioned, actually combines a modern table with actually strictly antique-looking legs, and it has marble samples in the top. Now, of course, since then, there's been a lot more work on Haupt, especially by Lars, and also Lucy Wood, who has written more about Haupt's time in England. And of course, this is all utterly crucial when you think about Chambers's relationship to practically any Swede of talent or importance who turned up in London during his time in London. The next piece to sort of, as it were, emerge was Lord Charlemont's extraordinary medal cabinet from Charlemont House, Dublin, which was in fact bought by the Courtauld in 1986 from Christopher Gibbs. it had been acquired by Lord Iver, who had installed it in Elverton Hall, where when it arrived in Christopher Gibbs's hands to sell, it still reputedly contained Lord Iver's socks wrapped in the original architectural drawings for it. It was made by Severin Alken, gilded by Dietrich Nicolaus Anderson. It's interesting that the Courtauld, and there's another one coming up, made so many acquisitions of this kind in this short period. And I think this can only be because of Nicholas Goodison's incredible input. I should say that this amazing cabinet is no longer on display in the Courtauld Gallery, the new Courtauld Galleries, which I think is highly unfortunate. This is how it was shown in 1996. In 1995, the Courtauld acquired a side table made for the drawing room at Gore House in about 1774. It was reputedly spotted in a public area in a block of mansion flats by someone from a sale room who had come to see something completely different in somebody's flat. And I think this just shows you how important serendipity is in finding these sorts of things. It's interesting that it also emerged around the time of the exhibition, so people, I guess, were sharpened up to the whole idea of looking for Chambers things. Not in the exhibition was the Gore House drawing room chimney piece. The story of this is that this had actually been in Gore House. Gore House which had by then turned into Carrington House, was demolished in the 1880s. Carringtons, unfortunately, didn't own the house. They only had a lease, but they did take care to remove the fittings, which is pretty interesting. And one thing they removed was this chimney piece, which, together with other bits of Gore House, including paintings by Angelica Kaufmann, was installed in his house in Dawes Hill, outside High Wycombe, which then became a boarding house of Wycombe Abbey School. The exhibition organisers visited Dawes Hill, and it's not impossible that it was the visit of the exhibition organisers that prompted Wycombe Abbey to want to sell their incredible chimney piece, which they eventually did, sold in 1995, inquired by the V&A in 1998. On acquisition, or rather before, I think actually on acquisition, it still bore the graffiti of some of the girl boarders at Wycombe Abbey. These are just examples of how the show gave a focus to the collecting of a certain kind of material. Now, coinciding with the show and the book was the V&A's detailed catalogue of its 862 Chambers drawings, 520 of which are in the great Franco-Italian album, which has been repeatedly referred to today, which is actually, of course, the crucial evidence for Chambers's training in Paris, Rome, and his crash course in Neo-Palladianism on the arrival in England, just showing how Chambers was preparing himself to dodge about in order to create works that would appeal wherever he was working. I think it's one of the good things about since 1996, of course, is that this album is now entirely online in the V&A on the V&A website. The cataloguing and this particular one, for instance, shows a sort of garden building, top left, in the monastery of the Capuchins in Paris. I think it's the only record of that. A bit of a frieze from the Louvre, two ancient Roman vases, and the Harpy fountain from the Bubbly Gardens, which I think has already been mentioned today. The cataloguing revealed how careful one had to be, as Chambers was when cataloguing, because Chambers was a silent editor of his own sources, such as this drawing on the right, which purports to be the throne at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, designed by Christopher Wren. But if you compare them, you will see that, first of all, he's taken away the Baroque base. This is a 1660s object. He's taken away the Baroque base and replaced it with one of those problematical early neoclassical neo-Greek feet. And when you think that this was actually done in or just before 1759, he's just arrived in England, a trip to Oxford. It just shows how careful you have to be when looking. He also, of course, changed the top. He took a kind of Baroque flourish off the top, and he converted it into this ideal neoclassical chair. And this is not the only time, as we have discovered in other cases in this series today, that he does such a thing. It's quite interesting, actually, his other comments on the drawing on the right. He's quite rude about the Arundel collection, now in the Ashmolean. Arundel collection of statues, very bad. Picture gallery, heads of great men, very bad. Presumably they're also now in the Ashmolean. However, he's much more complimentary about the roof of the Sheldonian, roof in the manner of Sant'Andrea delle Valle, which I think is so classically Chambers. I mean, who else would think that in a British building? The work of Janine Barrier was very important in terms of cataloguing and knowing what was going on in the Franco-Italian album. And I should also say that Frank Salmon was incredibly helpful in identifying a lot of the Italian works and other buildings in this catalogue. Janine's work, also already mentioned, fully exposed the workings of the Academy with the pensionnaire and Chambers swapping and copying drawings. Also revealed at this time was the Thomas Hardwick album at the Chester Beatty Library. And as far as I know, I'm not sure, but I think this is the case, it was sort of published in the early 2000s or late 90s, but hasn't been published since. And nothing seems to have happened. And I think that relates a lot to these sorts of drawings, and it would be really good to publish them. Now, here we are in Somerset House. Prince Charles's wishes for Somerset House have, of course, been wonderfully realized. It still carries its sophisticated and imaginative messages from France and Italy, not only in things like the wonderful entrance, which not even the rain and a few barriers can spoil, but also all those corridors filled with these identical doors. It really is like something out of ancient Rome. And I love the modern room numbers, which have simply been put on because they're obviously asking to take room numbers. And it's a really wonderful survival. And now the whole building is open. This picture was taken on the right during the Print Collectors Fair. You can see this building interacting with daily life, and one hopes that people, as they go around Somerset House, realize what a wonderful building it is. A more recent transformation has been the Great Pagoda at Kew, after extensive research, restored and finally opened in 2018. It's been given one of its 18th century colour schemes. It was discovered it had two colour schemes, even in the 18th century, and the dragons rotted and fell off. So this is the 1780s colour scheme, and the dragons have been put back. Some have been carved, and some have been 3D printed, and it's returned a sort of crispness and coherence that it lost when it was last repainted in the 1890s, so that it looked like a piece of Chinese lacquer. Now, to our eyes, interestingly, and I think it's interesting if you think about what has been said about Chambers and the exotic and China, to our eyes, the old one, which has instantly made the 1976 Courtauld catalogue even more old-fashioned than it already was, because it's featuring on that catalogue. To our eyes, it actually makes the present the present pagoda treatment actually look less exotic. But I think what we need to, but it makes us think, doesn't it, that actually they didn't. It just shows you, I think, if you do this to a building, and if you do it to a chambers building, it actually really helps in making us think about how people reacted to things in the time that they were created, and how careful we have to be, because this is probably colouring that was thought to be sort of exotic. It's been suggested that it's also the sort of colouring that you would have had on all kinds of temporary architecture of the time. Now, in a review of the 1996 publications, David Cast of Brynwell College commented that for all the attention given to Chambers' place in the history of architecture, it is not fixed, or like Somerset House, it has to be ever discovered and rediscovered. End of quote. In other words, Chambers is serious. Chambers is less pretty than Adam, and therefore less noticeable. And it doesn't surprise me really that his name is not evoked when he is, for instance, at the Soane Museum. It doesn't surprise me at all. It just shows you how hard we have to work to make him more noticeable. But I would maintain that he's less pretty than Adam, but in the end, much more subtle. And I think we can say that today's papers have fully revealed this complexity and the many questions that still surround his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we're running about 20 minutes late, so very, very briefly, I think you will all agree that we've had a splendid day of papers which have rekindled interest in and enthusiasm for the work of Sir William Chambers, and which, when developed, will produce a very fine publication that will mark the tercentenary of his birth and provide 21st century insights into his life and work. Themes that we've seen include connectedness, his ability to network, his social skills, his confidence gained through family wealth, his experience as a supercargo, and the influence of his commercial negotiating skills on his architectural career. We've also, this goes in hand, of course, with his cosmopolitanism, his mastery of languages, Swedish, English, French, Italian, his intellectual ambition in choosing to publish his writings rather than investing his wealth in other forms of representation. We've considered his agency in respect of patrons and in relation to artists with whom he worked. The jury is out on the role of George III on the Great Carriage, and this is precisely the type of complexity and nuance which is required in revisiting Chambers in 2023. We have seen just now in Michael's presentation the great importance, as with the coach, of craftsmanship in the work of Chambers. We've also, and it's been very strongly figured in this day of paper, seen semantic resonance, meanings embedded in the buildings and in the writings. We've been asked to consider very elegant parallels in the concept of societal process and in Chambers' approach to architectural promenade, the concept of the public visibility of his work, the civic monumentality of his work, no matter scale, even the diminutive scale of the casino. We've heard about the moral aesthetic dimension of his writings, and how these ideas were filtered through the treatise on Oriental gardening. And in the last session, we had fascinating insights into his role in terms of education, his own formation, that great information on Blondel coming through those notes for the Royal Academy. And also his approach to education. I found that fascinating, what he wanted these young architects to do. And then the amazing richness of the sewn material in terms of the transmission of Chambers' ideas. And of course, then we had the observations of Sherston then on the relevance for architects today. So it simply remains for me then to thank the speakers. If we can show your appreciation.